delighted to have Ole now going to present the second talk in a roaming fashion. So he's not going to have to be over here, but he's going to be able to demonstrate where he is. So let me just put this onto the screen for you.
Before I start, I think we'll send the first sample around because I'm sure you're anxious to taste some seaweeds. Let me first present myself. I'm really speaking to you tonight as an amateur, but I'm a happy amateur. I'm an amateur chef. I'm an amateur flavor scientist, and during my daily life, I'm really trained as a physical chemist, but I'm now a professor of theoretical physics. And you know, people who work in physics, they have the tendency to move around and do many different kind of things, and what they are the driving force are really curiosity. So for the last about 10 years, I've been interested in the science of cooking, and I've taken great pleasure in doing a lot of research communication, taking people's passion for food and flavor and health and nutrition, taking that as a starting point. And I've been writing popular science books about Japanese food, sushi, seaweeds, and most recently, umami. But it's all on an amateur basis. And in fact, the paper, Lars Williams and I and my colleagues are publishing in Flavor is the first scientific paper I've been writing in sort of food science and flavor science. So it's a great pleasure for me to be present here this evening at the launch of Flavor and tell you a bit about my experiences with a strange world. Maybe a strange world for some of you, which I'm going to tell you about, and that is the field of seaweeds, the sort of hidden food stuff we have in our oceans. So let me start making a little gastronomical Gedanken experiment. We eat from the life of the tree of life, and we have the different kingdoms. And if the vegetarians and vegans among you apologize, or excuse me for a minute, let's imagine that you have a cuisine which is only based on the animal kingdom. And then you realize what you're missing. And of course, the vegetarians will tell us what you're missing. So someone comes along and says, well, we not only have the animal kingdom, I'll give you the plants as well. So imagine the richness you have in the cuisine by getting the plants. But now, there's yet another kingdom out there, which in fact is the biggest kingdom in terms of organic mass. It's responsible for 80% of the organic production on Earth, fixation of carbon dioxide, and since these organisms are also performing photosynthesis, they're responsible for most of the oxygen in the air, and that's the algae. So I come and give you the algal kingdom. And as I say, it's huge, and most of them are pretty small. They're unicellular, and usually don't eat them. Some of them have good nutritional properties, but many of them are actually poisonous. But then there are the big algae, which you find in the ocean, the multicellular organisms, which we call seaweeds. And there's actually 3 different classes, and they're not very well defined, and ecologists are still fighting how we should classify them. But there's about 10,000 species. So I give you 10,000 new species. And so think of this just in a way as I give you plants. It's not that I give you tomatoes and potatoes and pulses. No, I give you 10,000 new species. And usually they're classified after their color. It's not such that you always count on that. But we have green sea lettuce as an example. And I have some of them in jars up here in water, and you can come and have a look at them after the presentations. So we have the green ones, we have some red ones. The example I've given here is flavour, porphyra, which is also the source of making maki for Japanese sushi. And then there's an example of a brown seaweed, which is sugar kelp, which we're going to taste in a moment. The seaweed that is being passed around is actually the seaweed which is on the very first page here. That's called macrokelp, and I'll come back to that. It's the world's largest seaweed. It grows to be 60 meters, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. The point is, there's a lot of it out there. So if you're not used to eat seaweeds, imagine this wealth you get in terms of species and hence also flavors. And this is something I'd like you to keep in mind when you come to flavor. What you're going to taste during my presentation are just the raw materials that are being dried. And of course you can see that they have different flavors, but imagine what a chef can do with them, what a chef like Lars can do with them. So it would be the same as I just send around, say, some dried tomatoes or some potatoes and some leeks, and you would say, well, that's nice and they're different flavors, but imagine once you get them in the kitchen what they can produce. Now let me just give a little piece of history here. This is a cartoon from Punch from the 1880s, and this is what will happen during a weekend. The local priest would take people out on the beach, and they'll pick up things and give them crazy names. And so here you can see the cartoon is ridiculous. The people walking around with special clothes when they were sort of walking around in nature. I had the pleasure to browse around in the archives or in the collections in the Natural History Museum out of Brompton Road. And up on the top gallery under the roof, there's a collection, actually the world's largest collection of seaweeds. They have about 600,000 species dried. And I found this little book, and in the book there's a poem. I'll read for you. It's a poem that was written in the early 1800s of a little girl, or maybe a teenager girl, in one of the Canal Islands. And the poem goes like this: algae, bright ordered by cryptogonist, defended, translate marine plants, as Linnaeus intended. You collect and admire us, we amuse leisure hours, then call us not weeds, we oceans gay flowers. So here the seaweeds are speaking to us. And this, I'm reading this poem to you because seaweeds has a connotation of weeds and something where you do like this. But it's just like if you were sort of not used to eat fish and you go and take rotten fish and you say, well, it doesn't smell very good, you can't eat that. And the same thing when you go on the beach and the seaweed is getting rotten and it rots very quickly and expels a compound called dimethyl sulfide, which is what we also associate with fish smell. And in large amounts, this is not very nice. However, in small amounts, this is exactly what we consider as the nice odor with the salty ocean, fresh ocean. It's the products that are released by the algae when they are turned over. So don't call us weeds. And of course, at other places in the world, they try to get around by this, calling them sea vegetables or sea greens. But let's call them seaweeds. That's what they are. This is what's inside the book. So this is what this girl took the different species and pressed them. It's a sort of a wonderful example of a pastime in the Canal Islands. So the question is, can we eat it? And I hope those of you who have tasted the seaweed, you would say it's edible. And by the way, remind yourself that you should drink some water along with it, because the seaweed has been dried and it loses about 90%, 80% of its weight upon dry, and it's taking that water back when you put it in the mouth. That's why it feels dry. Can you eat stuff like this? So what you see here on the left-hand side is sugar kelp. On the right-hand side you have bladderwrack, and certainly you can eat it, and I'll give you a little recipe on how to use bladderwrack in a second. Now, I'll just read these two statements about seaweeds, which people have been expressing over time. The Roman poet Virgil walked along the coast, and certainly he would probably walk in this rotten seaweed. He would say, there's nothing more disgusting than seaweed, and he would certainly not eat it. But in Asia, and this is my point, because in Asia, people still eat seaweeds in large amounts. In this part of the world, we've forgotten to eat seaweeds, but we're about to rediscover them. But the wise Chinese who said seaweeds is appropriate for distinguished guests, even kings. So in Asia, China and Japan and other places in Asia, seaweeds has always been considered as something valuable. It's even been used to pay taxes and offerings to the emperor. And of course, it's been eaten. So let me just start with something everyone knows from the sushi bar. This is seaweed wrapped maki, and the seaweed which is wrapped around there is actually made by a process like making paper. You have laver, which you chop up in a pulp like paper, and then you you make these pieces of paper-thin sheets in which the rolls are made. But it's made from a red algae called porphyra or laver, and I also have some laver in some of the dishes up here. You can come and have a look at it. It's a wonderful purple seaweed which is only 1 cell thick. And despite of that, it's very sturdy. Let me take one and show you. This is like a seafood. It's 1 cell thick, and see how flexible it still is. Come and play with it later. Another one, which I'm sure you know also from Japanese food, this is wakame, which is a brown seaweed, and you will find it in soups like this. This is the suemuru, which is the Japanese soup broth. And this is now taking me to flavoring, because the question is, what does this taste from? And the flavor which you have in this Japanese broth was studied scientifically about 100 years ago by a Japanese chemist, Hikune Ikeda. He studied in Europe, he was a physical chemist, and when he came back to Japan, he set his mind to figure out how come that this soup tastes what the Japanese say tastes umai, tastes delicious. And in order to understand what he then starts studying, you have to know how you make such a soup. It's based on a broth called dashi. And dashi is made from 2 components. And one component is, of course, seaweed, otherwise I would not be talking about it. And it's a giant brown seaweed called konbu or Salvina japonica. And you will find it in most Asian shops in different qualities. And I have some here. It's farmed in the ocean in Hokkaido and formed very big plates like this. And when you come and look at them and you say, he brought something that looks very dirty, there's some spots on it. And the spots that is on this is actually where the flavor is. This is where the flavor, which I'm going to tell you about now, that is where it resides. So the way to make this dashi, and probably Lars will tell more about it, and it's also explained in lots of the classical recipes and also in the paper we've been writing, that is, you make a sort of lukewarm extract, not too hot water, 60 or maybe up to 100 degrees, depending on which recipe you're using. And Lars has been exploring this and tried to figure out an optimal way of extracting what is coming out of this seaweed. So you extract it, and it gets a flavor which is very mild, sweetish, and it tastes umai. And once you've done that, you take away the seaweed, and then you plunge in a product called katsuobushi, which is a fish that is preserved 5 times over. It's cooked, it's salted, it's smoked, it's dried, it's fermented, and then it gets to be a hard piece, almost like wood, and then it's shaken in fine pieces and tossed into the soup. It's brought up to the boiling point, and then the soup is ready. You then put everything through a sieve, and then you have this clear soup. That's the dashi. And the dashi gets its flavor from what Ikeda found by analyzing what's in the seaweed. And here's the first piece of chemistry. And what he realized in this seaweed is that a large amount of an amino acid, or a salt of amino acid called monosodium glutamate, a small molecule with only 17 atoms, and he said that's the source of the umami flavor. And he didn't, at that time he didn't say umami, but he said it was delicious, so he coined this word umami as a combination of umai and mi, which means the essence of deliciousness. So this is the basis for umami, and that's of course not the whole story, because what about the fish? So until about 10 years ago, the umami flavor was not really recognized in the West, at least not amongst sense physiological people. And the reason for that was that there was no sort of receptor, a molecule that can identify this flavor that was still not discovered. It was discovered about 10 years ago, and it's a wonderful mechanism, and I'll just explain it to you, because once you know that mechanism, you also know why you do certain things in the kitchen that provides for the umami flavor. And the point is that the receptor is like a Venus flytrap. You know, this plant that catches insects, and in the hinge, that's the place where it binds the glutamate. So this receptor exists in the taste cell walls, in the taste buds, or the sensory cells in the taste buds. So here you have the taste buds in the cell, and this is the taste buds in the tongue, and this is the cells, and here you see the cell membrane, and in the cell membrane you have the receptors, the antennas that can identify the taste compounds. So this is the binding site for glutamate, and now it has been discovered there's a peripheral binding site for another set of compounds called nucleotides. And the nucleotides are the products or the simple molecules that are broken down from the nucleic acids that you have in the cells. And the mechanism of the receptor is such that small amounts of the nucleotides can enhance the binding affinity of glutamate. And glutamate in dashi comes from seaweed, and the nucleotides, which in this case from an amino acid called inosinic acid, inosinate, comes from fish. So it's broken down from the fish during this 5 times over conservation. And when these things are come together, you get this synergy. And in fact, we're now doing calculations on this receptor, and as the reason have found that we can sort of explain this extra binding by a change in dynamics of the receptor, and that is the molecular explanation of the synergy. So if you want delicious taste, it's not enough to have glutamate, you have something that goes with it. You have to have these nucleotides. Let me just give you one recipe. It's a very simple soup made of green peas. In green peas there's a lot of glutamate, and in that one I've tossed in a piece of scallop, and scallop has a lot of something called adenylate, which is a nucleotide, and then there's of course also some seaweeds. So that's sort of really enhancing the umami flavor. So this kind of pairing, which is different from other types of flavor pairing, this is based on a biochemical principle which is known. So you can take your own kitchen and go through it and see whenever you have something that is delicious, it's usually a pair of compounds that brings both of these two things together. And there are actually very few raw materials that have both. The porphyra in maki is an example of one that has both, but usually you need to bring them in a pair. Eggs and bacon is an example, egg with glutamate and bacon with inosinate. Mackerel in the sun-dried tomato paste is another example. And pizza is a study in umami where you start with it's basically a tasteless piece of bread, and then you add the tomato paste, and when you're sun-dried tomatoes, very ripe tomatoes with a lot of glutamate, and then you need some nucleotides. What do? You add some anchovies or some other kind of fish. You can even use various kinds of meats. You can have the dried ham, and if you want extra glutamate, you toss on some Parmesan cheese. So you get a lot of glutamate and free glutamate and also free nucleotides in foodstuff that is matured, that is fermented, that is aged. So you have to sort of punish the proteins in your food in order to get it out. So that's what cooking is about. That's really sort of trying to break down the proteins to get the free amino acids and the nucleotides. Now, let me tell you about what you had as the first taste here. That's the world's largest seaweed, and the guy here on the picture here, his name is Louis Drew. He's a very famous phycologist that is studying algae. He lives at the west coast of Vancouver Island, and he has a little company where he harvests mackerel kelp. So the first taster, it has been sent around, I suppose. The first taster is actually from Lewis's mackerel kelp. It's something you don't buy. I mean, you get it because I bring it to you. And I think this is one of the most delicious types of seaweed. It has umami, and then of course it also has a salty flavor. I'll come back to what salts they are towards the end. So I said this is the world's largest seaweed. It grows up to be 60 meters in a season. And if you do the calculation during the time where it grows the fastest, it's 2 centimeters an hour. So I put this in perspective. If we are interested in sustainability and providing foodstuff for a hungry world, this is a place to look. There's enormous organic production. So this is a bit about brown seaweeds. Then this is the sort of the star of tonight, because this is what you're going to taste in some of Lars's food. That's a red seaweed called dulse, and it's still eaten in a lot of places in Europe, in coastal areas, in Ireland, in Brittany, in Iceland, Nova Scotia, Maine, also British Columbia. And it's one of the most delectable seaweeds I know. And I think we should send it around now, dulse. So I have to confess, this is my favorite. And I think also the chef's, is one of the chef's favorite, and this is what Lars has been playing around at the Nordic Food Lab, trying to get extracts of this seaweed, both eating it as it is, but also making dashi. So the question is, can you make dashi out of this? And in fact, apart from the Japanese kombu, which is very well known as a source of glutamate for dashi, not many other seaweeds have been used. And for instance, if you try to make a dashi of wakame, you will be very disappointed because it hardly has any glutamate. So the question is, does this have any glutamate? And so we set out because the chefs say this is good flavor, and I agree with them, and they can make broths out of it. The question is this because it has a lot of glutamate? So this is a competitor to the Japanese kombu. So Lars and his colleagues made a lot of extracts, and here you can see some extracts of the red seaweed, the dulse here, to be compared with the classical Ichiban dashi, the first dashi of the Japanese production using konbu and katsuobushi, this fish, and this is just a straight konbu dashi, which is just the pure extract of konbu. So you can see the colors. And the question is, what's in this? So and this is where the science comes in. This is a picture from Lars's kitchen or laboratory. I don't know what you would call it. But the way chefs like Lars and his colleagues are doing together with scientists, that's of course, they work like chefs. They use the whole arsenal of measuring devices they have in the mouth. Of course, they taste the taste buds. And if you go and see how Lars works in his lab, one of the most important instruments he's got, that's the spoon in his pocket. And he'll take a spoon and spoon things up and taste it. And then, of course, where science comes in is when you do things systematically and actually go and measure, you make hypotheses and go and measure and see is it in this case true that you have high amounts of glutamate that can support the fact that this is a good dashi. And this is what we found, and this is what we've written about in one of these first papers in the new journal Flavor. And you can read that in the material that has been sent around. And since I'm a scientist, I'll just show you one diagram. And this is the so-called amino acid profile of 2 different dashis. There's a classical dashi made from what's called ransu konbu. It's one of the better qualities of konbu. There's a whole range of qualities. And if you measure the amount of glutamate you can get out of konbu, you actually see this amount correlates with what the Japanese call the quality. So this is a fairly good quality. And we measured the different amino acids, and there are a whole lot of peaks here. I don't have to look at the details, but you can see there's some that really gives high counts here, and that's the glutamic acid or the glutamate. So the gray columns here are the dashi from the kombu, and the other one is from dulse. We also studied other seaweeds, sugar kale and something called gracilaria. In all cases, they have hardly any glutamate, so here's a lot. But you also see differences between the gray and the black bars. And that is actually something Lars and his colleagues can pick up with the taste buds, because this dashi from the dulse, it's more complex. And the way we can decode the complexity in terms of flavor is that it not only has umami, but it also has sweet flavors and also some bitter flavors. And some of them are certainly due to the distribution of amino acids, because we find also some of the sweet amino acids and some of the bitter ones. However, what really makes dashi bitter when you cook it or boil it is other compounds. That's probably polyphenols that are much more bitter. Before we leave the red seaweeds, let me just remind you that many of you have probably used recipes with this classical Aries moss, which is a very good carrageenan provider. It provides a stiffening agent, carrageenan, which I mentioned briefly just in a second again. And there are large amounts of that in this carrageenan or Aries moss. And I have some Aries moss in the water up here, which you can come and have a look at. And let's finish with the green ones. And now we're ready to have the sea lettuce. It's been around great. And now those of you who've had the sea lettuce, which is the green seaweed, will probably agree with me. It has a completely different flavor. And this is great to put in a dressing. It's good to put in bread. So the bread we bake at home in my kitchen actually always have some seaweeds in it, and we use the green a lot because it has an interesting flavor of the ocean, and it's also a very good salt keeper. So I can already now tell you that we're making bread at home with hardly any salt, because the seaweed can substitute for the salt, and as I'll describe on the very last slide, this is not sodium chloride, this is potassium chloride. So it's good news for the blood pressure elevation. So it has almost the same salt value, but it's a lower weight of potassium salt. Before I come to a few examples of using this flavor in gastronomical dishes, and then give the floor to Lars, let me just tell you about one of the failures we've had. And you know, when we certainly do things in the kitchen, and also when we do things in the scientific lab, we have failures. We're doing things that turns out not to be as we expected or hoped. Here's an example of a kind of kelp, sugar kelp, big brown, which is quite common in our waters. That's not very good for making dashi, and what we found was that it has hardly any glutamate, and on top of that it also provides for a very viscous extract. And that's because a lot of polysaccharides seeps out, and all of you who have been swimming with sugar kelp or touched sugar kelp will know what I'm speaking about. It has this slimy excrete on the outside, and that's polysaccharides. And by the way, the reason why we call it sugar kelp is it has fairly large amounts of a sugar alcohol called mannitol. And if you see little spots on the sugar kelp that is being passed around, that's actually probably mannitol that has been seeped out and sits dry on the surface. And it has a sweetness about 60% of that of sucrose, table sugar. So you might even think of it as using as a sugar substitute. And it's interesting because there are no calories. We don't have enzymes to digest this compound. So before I talk about gastronomy, let me just show you this slide and do one experiment which I'll ask Lars to help me to do. Let me just go through this very quickly. And actually there's an upcoming paper I wrote about the gastrophysics of seaweeds that will come in one of the next issues of Flavor, so you can get the data there. And here just repeat what you got in seaweeds from the point of view of nutrition. So we've been speaking about flavor and delicious food, but let me just make a statement with this slide, and that is that seaweed basically have everything you need except calories. You can't live off seaweed because there's not enough calories, and that's because the carbohydrates or polysaccharides are very complex. We don't have the enzymes to digest them, so there's no calories, so not much calories. High in protein. You have these dietary fibers, that's the nutritionist names for the polysaccharides or the carbohydrates. Very large amounts, good for the digestion. You have most of the important vitamins, even B12, which you don't find in land plants. there's no D vitamin, however. Iodine, very depending on which species there is. There's more potassium salts than sodium salt, and this is what I already mentioned to you. And then on a draw weight basis, the mineral content is typically 10 times as large as in plants. So these are very good for giving you minerals. So if you tell your kids to eat spinach because they get iron from spinach, I say eat sea lettuce because there's much more iron in sea lettuce. There are trace compounds, and what really interests me, and this is basically the way I got started interested in seaweeds, because my profession as a biophysicist is to study the biological membranes and the fats and membranes, the lipids. And the lipids that you find in seaweed, as well as other stuff, food from the ocean, that's very high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. In fact, the sea and the lower part of the food chain, the algae, that is the providers of the omega-3 fatty acids. That's where it's produced. They have the enzymes to make these compounds. Then they accumulate in fish and shellfish, and that's where we get the largest amount. But if you want to go to the source of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, you go to the kingdom of the algae. That's where it's produced. And even though they're only 2 to 5%, it's still actually more than in a lean fish. And we still don't know whether, in this form they're here, whether they're more precious than in other kinds of food, because we don't know too much about the antioxidants that they come along with. So that's something to discover. What is the most interesting from the point of view of nutrition, and also maybe from the point of view of evolution, based on what sort of the question, what should people like us eat with the genes we've got, the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 is close to 1 in seaweeds, and that's the same also in fish and shellfish, or at least it's comparable to the two amounts are comparable. In fact, the dose you're having, you have 4 times as much omega-3 as omega-6. One of the major problems we have in the Western world, that is the food we eat is overloaded with omega-6 on the expense of omega-3. So in Europe, we typically eat 5 to 8 times. Are we doing all right with this? 5 times, 8 times. Okay, I'll go over. We eat 5 to 8 times more omega-6 than omega-3. In the United States, it's 20 times. So that's the way we're going. And this is not what our genes are telling us to eat. So now I'll do an experiment with us. And do I have just 2 or 3 more minutes? We should just do an experiment just to show you the marvelous thing with seaweeds. And I'm going to take a dry piece of seaweed, the very same as you got as the first taster. And I'll show you how it looks when it's dry. And we'll put it in water, and then we'll see what's going to happen. And I think we can use this water. If you hold it. So
you do this magic trick all the time.
So yeah, we're traveling around doing this experiment. So this is the kind of stuff you just got. It's a dry piece of seaweed, and it's been sitting, I think I've had it for half a year. It can last for a very long time when it's dry. It sucks up water in your mouth. It's taking the water back as it's given off when it was dry. Now we'll put it in water. It's the world's largest brown seaweed. So I would claim you have to be a biologist to see that this is not alive. So thank you, guys. So now you can dry it again, but of course it's losing some of its salt when you put it in water. So let me just finish off with a few examples of how I've worked with chefs over the last couple of years, and this is an introduction to Lattes. So he's going to tell you about how he's using extracts of the red seaweed dulse to infuse different kinds of dishes, to impart the dishes, the flavors of the seaweed, in particular umami flavor. So I'm not going to take this show from you, but let me show you a couple of other examples. This is a dish from Noma, where they're using a green seaweed, the sea lettuce, which is sort of a whale sitting over some raw shrimp, which is underneath here. So this is the raw sea lettuce that provides for this beautiful cover of the sort of hidden treasure underneath the shrimps, and then various kind of herbs from the beach on top. This is a side dish from Jacob Mink, a Danish chef, whom I've been working on my book on seaweeds. And Jacob is very preoccupied with flowers, presentation with flowers. You see this here with flowers, which is actually a fish dish, and he's garnished it with two types of seaweed. There's a mackerel kelp, which Lars and I just put in water, and then there's rehydrated iris moss. And the moss here has colors purple, from purple all the way from purple to white, and it starts being very red when it's fresh, but when you bleach it, you get different colors, so you can make wonderful presentations. The interesting thing with this seaweed is it doesn't have much taste. But that brings me back to some of the things Pierre said, because the perception of flavor is not only taste and odor, it's also the texture in the mouth, the resistance you have when you chew. So this is a very interesting way of perceiving the flavor of seaweed, that is the mechanical resistance in the mouth. It's interesting to chew, sometimes it's even crunchy. And by the way, I promised to give you a recipe using bladderwrack. I forgot it, but it's very simple. You just take the fresh bladderwrack, the outermost tips, throw them in hot water, that is, you blanch them, and then put in nice water, and then you have, first of all, they turn completely light green. They don't have much taste, but they have interesting texture. They're very wonderful to chew, so it's good to put in a salad. And finally, let me show this piece of work, and this is another chef, Klaus Stübeck, with whom I last year wrote a book about umami. And here's an example how Klaus is using, it's basically an old trick from Harris Bar in Umidi in Venice, and that is how can you eat raw veal or raw meat which hardly has any taste? So, well, you have to add umami, and one way of adding umami is to have an emulsion. It's a mayonnaise with some umami giver. It could be English sauce, or it could, in this case, Klaus is using the red seaweed. So in this way you make this meat, and I admit that I don't think this meat is tasty at all. It doesn't taste of anything. You have to add umami. So here's the seaweed used to add umami. And I think I now made it to the end. But I'll just finish with this picture here. This is a Japanese temple. And we started in Japan talking about flavor and umami. And I talked to you about dashi. And we talked about making dashi from seaweed and fish. But of course, if you're a Buddhist or vegetarian, you don't eat fish, so what do? So it's the Zen monks in the temples in Kyoto in 1300, they discovered you could make a wonderful dashi, replacing the fish, that is the katsuobushi, by shiitake, dried shiitake mushrooms. And we now know why that works. And that's because in the dried shiitake mushrooms, there's very high levels of the nucleotide called guanylate, which then resembles the inosinate from the fish. And in fact, the synergy that can be provided by guanylate, it's much, much more powerful. So a dashi made from a seaweed extract with shiitake mushrooms, that's a wonderful dashi. And I'd like to close with this note, because we talk about flavor and we talk about delicious food, but we also have huge problems with nutrition and lifestyle diseases. We have problems with some of us eat too much. We have elderly citizens and sick people who eat too little. The question is, how can we provide delicious food for them? And just to take an example, I don't know if you will have the same problem as me. I have problems eating 600 grams of green stuff every day, vegetables, whatever it may be. And I think it's because it doesn't taste good enough. And the monks have discovered what the secret is, that is to impart umami to it. So I think the lesson here from the temples and the lessons for using flavor and also not only making delicious meals but also healthy meals and providing us with ways in our home kitchen to actually make food that is delicious, even with vegetables. Dashi, whether it's Lasa's dashi or your own dashi, and the insight in looking for the synergy between glutamate and nucleotides may actually help us in that direction. Thank you very much for your attention.